first day I reported to my new duty station as a senior executive was 9/11. And this is where life rapidly shifted in short order a little bit later that morning. And I pause because even to this day, and I feel it right now emotionally, okay? You're probably going to see it in my face because almost 3,000 people were murdered that day and they never should have disappeared. They never should have lost their lives. It never should have happened. I literally am haunted the rest of my life with that reality, the what ifs of history. I still wake up sometimes in, sweating over the what ifs of history. I pause again because did I know, even though the system was blinking red since 1998 per George Tenet at the CIA, they knew that Al-Qaeda was up to something. Remember 93 when I was sitting there on the terrorism desk?
Yep.
It's not like we didn't know. Remember, we already had Cole Incident, Kaibar Towers, a bunch of others. But it wasn't a priority. Bush was the new president. Wasn't a priority. Counterterrorism was not even on the list. It was on a list, but it wasn't where it mattered. Just wasn't. And I went home and I remember calling in very early the next morning. Of course, I sat in front of the TV. I just sat there, just absolutely, it was hard to break away.
Everybody went home?
I went home because I was so new.
Right.
They had crisis teams. Remember, there had been crises.
Yeah. Okay.
This clearly was going to be something way different. And remember, there were other planes that they had attempted, or one of them we know, Shanksville, right? Pentagon, right?
Yep.
It would have been way worse if they hadn't hit the part of the Pentagon that had just recently been modernized. And then, of course, the two towers. People don't realize those towers are actually quite susceptible to that type of terrorist attack.
Right.
And it wasn't like there hadn't been attempts. Bohica had been exposed where they're going to hijack airliners. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Remember. But 93 sort of had been forgotten, I guess. Remember what they said. Remember the general, what he said to me personally, right?
Yep.
I was right there when he said it.
Yep.
So I went home because I wasn't part of a crisis team. I called in later, said, yeah, you better come in. And then the next 4 months are a blur, a total blur. It would take hours and hours, if not days, to unwind those next 4 years. But it's critical that I then tell you what I was confronted by. Because what I was confronted by was the very thing that I had taken an oath to support and defend. And yet I was confronted in the secret world with what happens if your own government decides to violate the Constitution willfully as an act of commission, not omission, commission. I mean, I'll even ask this rhetorically to any and all of your listeners, okay?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Subscribers. What if you're confronted? Do you just, as I was, look the other way? So I'm in 4 months later. I didn't even become feeling normal again. And I was sitting there in a Marriott hotel in New Orleans celebrating Mardi Gras in mid-January with family. So what happened after 9/11? A whole bunch of meetings were taking place. Cheney, who had basically been given the national security portfolio by Bush, just kind of ceded that to him.
Yep.
Plus energy. They went into like deep emergency mode, right? And there were certain, may have heard of COG, continuity of government.
Yep.
I used to be a part of that in terms of what happens if, right? Special procedure put into place. And there's actually emergency executive orders on the books, right? So they went into a version of that.
Yeah. Can you explain that to people who may not know what it is?
So what happens if, it could be an extreme natural disaster. It could be war, right?
Yep.
Where the president, as the executive, does have where certain emergency powers are allowed to invoke. He can invoke certain and there's basically a standing set of executive orders basically, and some are acts, right, that prescribe what you do. And there's basically, there's facilities where government can reassemble. They
Right.
even go through training for that, right? So he's down in the Situation Room, which is underneath the White House.
Cheney
In particular,
Yeah.
I mean, Bush would be there too, but Cheney basically was leading. And of course, they're having these meetings right after 9/11. What else can we do? What else can we do? Are there any other authorities? There are certain executive orders, without getting into the weeds, that allow the government to increase their ability, right, to provide protection for the country. Still has to be within the bounds of the Constitution. You're not allowed, even under emergency circumstances, to basically suspend the Constitution. You're not.
Right.
But there are things where you have some flexibility. Okay, even under FISA, I'm going to introduce FISA under the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which we had annual training to ensure that, because of scandals in the 70s, to ensure that we did not, without a warrant, right, we couldn't just routinely collect, except under special training circumstances.
Sure.
And even then, it was highly controlled.
Right.
You couldn't collect, analyze, et cetera, because that's sacrosanct. It's the Fourth Amendment, okay?
Right.
Super high bar. But
Right.
you can. And even under FISA, there was provisions to hot pursuit, meaning you could go after somebody, foreign intelligence, U.S. person, U.S. citizen, resident, basically foreign, but resident, right?
Okay.
Legal resident, right? / visitor, but legal. Could be visa, could be green card, or some equivalent, or there's different visas.
Okay.
Or, interestingly enough, U.S. corporation. That not just stateside, not just boundaries, but also overseas.
Okay.
Which means even when I was in RC 135, we couldn't just start collecting. Now, we did have a emergency support mission. If someone was in distress, ship in distress or in distress, we then could help assist. But that was specifically to help save lives or
Right.
rescue, search and rescue.
Right. Sure.
So FISA had criminal sanctions. You violate it, $10,000 fine, 5 years in prison for every incident in which you violate the Fourth Amendment rights of a U.S. person.
Okay.
Criminal use, the 18, U.S. 18, right? That's the criminal code. I pause because here I was. Shortly after 9/11, I discovered that they were taking the vast power of NSA, extraordinary power in which they essentially had carte blanche to do just about anything when it came to collection.
Mm-hmm.
But now use that vast power, in addition to overseas, use that vast power. Remember, they had failed. Remember, that's why Pearl Harbor, what happened was so critical, because the whole thing, this whole national security establishment was set up after the end of World War II was to preclude another surprise attack.
Yeah.
Here, not only were we, quote, I'll say surprised, we weren't, failed to keep 3,000 people. We did not keep them out of harm's way. That's our fundamental, right? We failed the nation. Mm-hmm. The workforce knew it. Management leadership went into denial mode. They just could not accept, right? Workforce, I could tell you just horror stories about what it was doing to the workforce, because this is not supposed to, it's on our watch. We are the watchers. We're the protectors of the nation electronically. We failed. And they're asking what you can imagine. Congress is now asking questions. What the heck happened? Now, I will be the first to acknowledge it was a systemic failure. Okay? And there's a lot of reasons for that. But NSA had a critical part of all this in terms of what they should have known, could have known, and didn't provide and report, even with the mess of their IT and the databases and everything else that I mentioned earlier. Mm-hmm. I'm finding out that they're now turning the vast years of NSA in partnership with certain key corporations for access and retrieval on the U.S. U.S. was always blacked out, and allies, right? You didn't just routinely spy on your friends, quote unquote. You didn't. Sort of. It was
When did this
bad.
happen?
It was bad form. This is September. Remember, September 11th. So in the 2 weeks after 9/11, I'm finding out the decisions had been made in the deepest of secrecy, super hush hush.
Right.
We're going to essentially suspend the Fourth Amendment. We will bypass FISA. There's special procedures. Even at one point, I was part of the affidavit process. We go up to the secret court, which is housed in the Department of Justice, to provide affidavit to say we need a warrant from the secret judges, which are actually on rotation, appointed by the Chief Justice.
And you bypass the secret judges.
Bypass FISA. They wouldn't even know about it in the early days, the early years. Didn't even know about it. Bypassed it. So, I mean, you talk about what do I do? I'm saying, wait a minute. I took an oath to support and defend the Constitution. Now my government is suspending that part of the Constitution because they've, under the imprimatur of national security, it's necessary. I began to blow the whistle within September, within channels at NSA. That's where I started. Boss, Office of General Counsel, stopped there, because then I went to Inspector General later.
Okay.
Office of General Counsel. I'm on a phone call with him. This is early October.
How much thought did you put into this before you started to blow the whistle? Before you started
a lot, but it was all super compressed. Because remember, I had a full-time job. I was leading a team, communications. How do you keep people informed as they're coming in round the clock? People are burning out. You can't get people burnt out. You can only sustain crisis mode for so long.
Right.
Usually about a week or two, and then you just start getting fried. People are having heart attacks. People are collapsing. People are sleeping in the cars out in the parking lot.
Jesus Christ.
Because they realize, oh my God, you can imagine people's guilt, the guilt they felt.
Yeah.
And so they're doubling down, but they're burning themselves out.
Right.
And I was in all the leadership team meetings, right? The ones I weren't in, the only ones I weren't in were the ones that were my supervisor, who was the number 3 person, the signals intelligence director. She would have special meetings with the very top dick, right? I was a much smaller, even smaller. I was part of sort of the 40, but then there was sort of like the 7 or 10.
And by the way, sorry to clarify, who specifically was making the orders to that, or who was specifically telling you or instructing you that now we're going to start bypassing the secret court and the FISA?
Well, this is where I had my moment of truth.
Okay.
True moment of truth. I already was aware that they were shifting equipment, buying equipment from like the HPs of the world to put them on US networks to quote unquote consume and just suck up all kinds of data.
Okay.
Just raw data. No constraints, didn't matter. Okay. Bulk collection is what they called it, but it's really mass surveillance.
Right.
Without getting into deep, but they starting with, phone calls, starting, emails, later expanded very quickly.
How long of a time period are we talking?
Only a couple of weeks.
Couple of weeks, phone calls, emails.
Right, I already started. Remember, I already had the capacity to do all that. I already had all that. Yes, I became directly aware of it. Then I started poking around.
Okay.
I was making trouble already, good trouble. Okay. Okay. Good trouble. Early on. I was already being tagged. I remember I was a new hire and I'm already being tagged. So what do you do? So I confront the Office of General Counsel. Now, it turns out because this program is so secret, it was in its own compartment. The name of the program was its own compartment, which was inside what they call exceptionally controlled information, ECI, which is way beyond even SCI. But it had its own compartment. Its own compartment was the name of the program. This program name in itself was classified.
You never said it.
Oh, no, I can say it now.
Oh, you can?
But back then, people who said it was way under their breath.
What was it called?
Stellar Wind.
Oh, okay.
We called it, colloquially between us, cosmic fart.
That's amazing.
Okay, so Stellar Wind, interesting name, but there's a whole office that handles program project names.
Very famous
but the name
now.
But the name itself, right? The program name itself, which is extraordinarily rare because the program in itself is used as a cover. This program was so secret. It turns out
more secret than secure What is SCI?
Yes.
Compartmented.
Sensitive compartmented information.
Yeah.
Now there's handling caveats, which are basically compartments or can be.
Right.
How do you distribute? Right. There's classified, secret, top secret, standard. But then there's the SCI world and above. Okay.
Got it.
And it just gets hyper, you get super secret. The more there's Q level, what we call Q level clearance, which was for like nuclear stuff.
Okay.
My mom is a secretary at Barksdale, where she met my dad because he was, in Strategic Air Command back in the mid 50s. Had a Q clearance because she was the secretary for one of the senior officers.
Holy shit.
Because she's looking at stuff that's quite sensitive, right?
Yes,
even though she was an administrative assistant, right?
Right. Okay, I got it. Wow.
So,
just a couple of weeks before they start sucking up phone calls and emails from from everybody.
They thought, they didn't know if there was another attack. I understand why they did what they did. I understand. I get that. And I remember under a short term, you're allowed to go after threats without a warrant, but you still have to go seek it shortly thereafter. It's all prescribed in FISA. But they didn't say, we don't have time for that. Forget it. Don't have time for it. Just bypass it. Right. They just wanted the data. Now, why? I'm incredibly alarmed at the developments within just a couple of weeks.
Okay.
First week in October, turns out it's also, I didn't know it at the time, was officially when the president's surveillance program went into effect. It's called the PSP under Bush. PSP, President's Surveillance Program.
Okay.
Umbrella program, authorized by the president. The primary umbrella program at NSA, which became the executive agent, right, for the program was Stellar Wind. That was the umbrella program itself, encompassing a number of other sub-programs.
Got it.
There was one counsel that I'm aware of, I mean, based on my understanding even to this day, there was one particular lawyer in the Office of General Counsel. He was actually interviewed once as part of a larger NPR Frontline report. Actually, I was interviewed for that. Myself, Diane Rourke, Bill Binney, Kirk Wiebe, Ed Loomis. I'm on the phone. I said, what are we doing? We're violating the Fourth Amendment. FISA is and there was a whole set of internal NSA. Nothing is done without, you have to have authorities, right? And it goes all the way down to just like individual procedures, standing procedures. NSA had and been refined over the years based on the FISA. FISA had been updated 5 times to keep up with the times since 1978.
Wow.
Most people don't realize that. So they had special procedures for handling FISA because you're quote unquote spying on a U.S. person with sometimes without a warrant initially. But the normal procedure was you have to get the warrant, right, up front. So I said, what are we doing? He says, exigent conditions apply. Direct quote, exigent conditions apply. We just need the data. Don't ask any more questions, Mr. Drake. I say, wait a minute.
This is the attorney.
The attorney inside the Office of General Counsel who happened to be read into the program.
Oh, thank you, Steve, for defining it for my 3rd grade education. Situations that allow law enforcement to conduct warrantless searches and seizures under certain urgent conditions. Okay. Exigent circumstances apply. We have to go outside the Constitution here.
Yes. Right there. Yeah. Now, hot pursuit. That is allowed. Hot pursuit was allowed under FISA for a short period of time.
Oh, okay.
It was. It wasn't like, exigent, but there was a legal standard built into FISA, Fourth Amendment compliant, but you could temporarily, because sort of the immediacy of it, you could actually go after, surveil a U.S. person. What if they were intending harm? What if it was that immediate? But remember, okay? Sure. That's one reason it was there. That was actually in the FISA. All that was bypassed. Okay, I mean bypass meaning it was going to be a permanent, warrantless, basically a general warrant, which is actually unconstitutional. Now, some would say people even then said, Tom, you don't understand. You didn't make the decision. Shut up. Be quiet. Things will take care of themselves. This is a crisis. Sometimes we have to do things differently. I kept talking. So back to the conversation with this attorney. I said, well, then why don't we go to Congress? Congress legislates. One of the things that's happening now, you see this in Trump 2.0, where even Congress, you get into this whole thing about can executive override or can they well, I guess that's another conversation. Legislates. If the law of the land and FISA, which applies in this case, is no longer sufficient. Remember, they passed the Patriot Act a couple months later, actually late October.
Right.
Basically, which another component in all this, to begin
to literally the next month, right?
To begin legalizing what was okay, to begin legalizing, they did through acts, which is ex post facto, which in itself, ex post facto law, which in itself, that's unconstitutional. You can't pass a law to, in essence, legalize what you were doing or conducting, if even executive action, that was unlawful or unconstitutional, particularly if it's unconstitutional.
Right.
But remember, FISA ultimately falls under the Fourth Amendment. Okay. It is a statute in law with criminal sanctions if you violate it. Didn't matter anymore. All this didn't matter. I was told it's a quaint document. It's another conversation. Dustbins of history. We live in different times now, Mr. Drake.
Okay.
Different times. We're just going to be different. We're just going to take the thing that makes us American, the very thing that defines the foundational law of the land. Go to Congress. I'm talking to the attorney. Go to Congress, change the law. He says, with what we want to do, they would say no. In that moment, right as he said it, hair standing up on the back of my neck. Because I realized in that moment of truth, it didn't matter what law was. It didn't matter. We're not going to even bother. If they were so worried that if they went to Congress, the Congress would say no, because they wanted to get away with this. They wanted to do this anyways. Didn't matter. I'm at NSA. I begin, because I'm bringing back, new thoughts, and then there's people at NSA that because I had an enterprise responsibility. I'm going through the ends. I even went overseas in a couple of cases. So I'm going to the ends of NSA to find the very best projects. The very best program is to help those improve themselves at the same time. And that's why we were doing these special reviews. Okay. In the course of doing all that, just to compress all this, to get to 2001, I was finding people phenomenal, call it SIGINT skunk works, like Lockheed Martin skunk works that built the U-2 in the SR-71. Okay. Phenomenal, because NSA realized in the 90s in particular, they faced a huge challenge with the digital age. They couldn't just, because that's the only thing they knew. Oh, we'll just bring everything back, store it, and figure it out later. Bring everything back, store it.
Yeah.
How do you suck the ocean dry? Can you just, wait a minute, leave the ocean where it is. Just keep track. And this is how I was taught, even on the RC-135. Essential elements of information, metadata, the critical information, the things that you need to know about. The stuff that's routine, you just keep track of that. It's only when it turns to something other than routine that you care. Mm-hmm. That's kind of the signal to noise ratio. When it rises above a certain level, you then say you notice it, but you can't notice everything.
Right.
I can't always look at every straw in the haystack, can I? I need to know though if one of the straws, right, turns. How do I know that? Well, I have to know when it turns or it catches on fire. Okay. I got to know about that.
Right.
That's part of indications of warning as well, ultimately in terms of how you provide that to support, which is stated in the preamble of the Constitution, providing for the common defense of the United States. I not only just took that to heart, I lived it as well as others did, silent warriors, for years and years and years. That's how I was taught. It's what I experienced. It's what I provided the American people in secret in the national security space. So NSA kept pushing back, resisting, because it meant change. They were so wedded to their legacy systems that they weren't willing to look at something differently. You know, the famous quote from Einstein, keep doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result. It's a form of insanity. This is institutional insanity. As I was told at one point after I got to NSA, well, joined NSA as a senior executive, Tom, you just don't understand. That's not how we do things around here. So, but this is actually going to improve how we do things around here. Oh, that's not how we do things. They just were wedded to how they did things. So huge resistance. In fact, they tried to shut the program down because it was embarrassing. But I'm bringing back, and then I'm meeting people inside NSA super frustrated because the new director, now it's 1999, Michael V. Hayden, who's central to my story,
right,
central to my history, central to what then happened with, as though he's done a very good job, okay, of faking and diluting. He's very articulate, and he has a lot of respect still, you know, as a former, and he didn't become CIA director after he was the principal deputy director of the new director of national intelligence. So it's 1999. He said, you know, this is the same thing as we encountered in World War II, Manhattan Project. We got to treat this as a Manhattan Project. We have to partner with industry. We need to buy this solution. And it's going to cost a lot of money. You know why? Because it's a really big problem. Why is it a big problem? Because all kinds of data. It's a big data problem. They actually called it that, the big data problem.
Mm-hmm.
Here's the funny thing. In the 90s, particularly the latter part of the 90s, NSA historically, for a number of years, had published their 5 top challenge problems. They had more than that. But the 5 top were the priorities. One of them was the big data problem. So you can imagine NSA, necessity being the mother of invention, let's go solve it. I met the engineers, met the programs and projects, and a whole collection analysis, right, and reporting to do exactly that on behalf of the American people. They solved the big data problem, the core of it, prior to 9/11. Had already solved it. But NSA, nope, the corporate decision is, and there are people who actually got punished for this internally, punished. We've already made the decision. We're just going to go to, and they spent, we're talking the initial version of this transformation, this whole transformation effort, which I was actually a part of. Mm-hmm. I was in the inside of it. But it became clear all they wanted to do was create a contract vehicle to spend billions and billions and billions of dollars. Now, I'd already gotten an insight on that back in the late 80s.
By partnering with private industry.
Yes.
Okay.
Commercial,
and
private, but military. We're talking those who had access and had the proper security clearances or could. We're talking like the SAICs of the world. We're talking about the Booz Allens of the world.
Right.
We're talking about the IT portions of those companies.
Yes.
Okay.
So just to clarify, when you say you had already solved it, by doing what?
NSA had already solved it internally. Not by buying it. They were going to make it. But that was the historical legacy of NSA. They had contractors going all the way back.
Yep.
But they weren't just going out to industry and just wholesale, here, we'll just give you a bunch of money, figure it out.
Right.
Remember what Eisenhower warned the nation about in his farewell address in 1961? The rise of military in the halls of the rise of the military industrial complex. Now it's a military industrial intelligence complex.
Right.
If you're a contractor and you have shareholders, but guess what you're going to, perversely incentivized to do? Why solve the problem?
You're going to
I started seeing it. I was seeing it in the 90s. I was already seeing it on this program. People were like, we're going to buy lines of code. Well, if I'm a contractor, okay, there's a joke about this. I'm just going to code me up a Winnebago today because I could just crank bunch of lines of code just to get paid more. There was one project that we analyzed. The government was paying the contractor $8,000 for every line of code. So that's what you do. More lines of code. It's not about lines of code. It's about the functions that provide support to the mission, fulfill the mission.
Yes, right.
Provide for the common defense on behalf of the American people. That's your responsibility. And you have a fiduciary responsibility to make sure that the money is spent wisely and that you account for it.
Right.
So He decided Trailblazer is the program.
Trailblazer.
Pre 9/11, 1909.
Right.
He was on Newsweek magazine front page. He was inviting reporters and whining and dining him at his residence on Fort Meade. I mean, he went political, and he was dazzling the overseers, the oversight committee, because he carried that, and he had those 3 stars, right? He's sitting there in front of them, and he was not a technologist. That's the last thing he was.
Right.
He actually used to be a Bulgarian linguist in the military. At one point, he actually headed up one of the units that I was a part of in the military, not when I was in, but he goes all the way back, okay? But he'd also worked, interesting enough, in George Bush first. He also had been part of basically the military, the intelligence side of the National Security Council. So he had inroads. He was operating with the players, as it were. That's one reason he was called when he was in Korea. Hey, how would you like to become the director of NSA?
Right.
So he's going to buy the solution. The original program was just shy of $4 billion. The amount of money that was spent originally on one of the programs, this is one of them, but don't have time to go into all of them, but there was a number of these really skunk works that were solving these challenge problems at NSA that they actually had defined as a challenge problem. This wasn't like, we're just going to go off and just play. No, there were labs that they did that too. This was to solve the problem. So a little over $3 million solved it well prior to 9/11.
Thin thread?
Thin thread. But if you're spending millions, but then you've got this other program that's billions, and you're going to buy it, not make it, why would what was happening is that people's careers, promotions are being based on how large you grew your organization.
Right.
How much money did you bring in? How much money did you allow out to a contractor? You didn't, in fact, you became further and further away from the day-to-day of and even the big contractors got all kinds of pass-through fees because they're just giving it to the subs to actually do. They didn't, a lot of cases didn't even do the real work themselves.
Right.
Who's doing real work? Oh, it's not about real work. Look, I had already blown the whistle on an earlier program, one of at the time, the most expensive automated data processing system at NSA called Minstrel. Anytime you bring up Minstrel at NSA, probably not as much now because most of the principals have gone or are dead, it was super, super embarrassing. At the time, it was incredibly expensive. You're talking 1985, it was awarded, right, for almost 200. We're talking almost $200 million. That's a ton of money for an IT system. They bought a bunch of hardware, right, at inflated prices, and then it never delivered. They ultimately spent about $250 million on it by the time they were finished. The same core people that were on Minstrel got another bite at the apple under Trailblazer, but way bigger. But this was going to catapult NSA because they were under a huge pressure. You're falling behind, becoming less relevant. Right. You're going deaf.
Right.
Literally. Bringing all this data back can't make sense of it. Or you're getting to know more and more, and this is sort of a twist here about what I'm going to say, knowing no more about less and less. So you become myopia, right? Get incredibly narrow.
Right.
Because there's all this stuff that's just like as they would say, it's on the cutting room floor in some database, obscure database somewhere. How do I know its value? This problem was solved. Now, I was part of that because what I was doing was advanced analysis. On the technical side, I was analyzing software and how it was being developed, how it was being designed and developed and deployed. So we're talking soup to nuts, full, you call it life cycle, okay, including maintenance, operations, O&M, operations and maintenance, where a lot of the contractors knew they would get even more money just because they could just milk it. We used to joke about that at Booz, we'll milk it. And if we can't get them to milk it, we'll just repackage it and sell it to some other government agency and milk it some more. They actually had an investigation. The general counsel comes out from Mountain View. That was their home office. It was Mountain View, California. He comes out, he does his own internal investigation, brings in a lot of us to interview. And I looked at him, I said, weren't we remember, give him my background, right? My background already, just the summary of it. He's sitting there in his chair, and I looked at him at one point, in his interview. And I said, were we under an obligation to deliver something that actually worked? No, we weren't. Contract plus. All we had to do is show best effort. I just stopped. I mean, my jaw just like dropped. He didn't care whether or not the program delivered. All he cared about was that the funds kept flowing. Didn't matter what was developed. It didn't matter it didn't work. It didn't matter that it was a piece of crap. And I'm being polite when I say that. Didn't matter. This was my now dawning realization after having worked with extraordinary people that you'll never hear about in the field when I flew, right? Especially overseas. Dedicated to the mission, not to just lining their pockets. Yeah, I get in the American capitalism, make a profit.
Right.
But now you're talking obscene levels of profit. And then wait a minute, it didn't matter that it's one thing you've spent a lot of money and you actually deliver something. It's a whole nother thing to spend a whole lot of money and not deliver. Increasingly, they weren't delivering. And then they would just, because it's what they call sunk cost in the economics, you just keep dumping more money and money into the hole, right?
Right.
So long story short, in February so to give you a background, that I was very sensitive now to corruption, to fraud, waste, and abuse. Had already been a whistleblower. I was even a whistleblower in the military, but that's another story. When I was on the Compass Call mission, Big Safari, right? Big Safari is another interesting program. It's sort of the umbrella program. It funds a lot of this, including what I was doing overseas. February 2001, I just moved into a new house where I live, right, in Maryland. I was doing really, really well. Okay. I had special projects, contracts. I was working with like the University of California, Riverside. I was still doing all my consulting. I even expanded. I was now a principal in a boutique.com. This is the late 80, 98, 99, 2000, early aughts. Flying all over. I used to fly in the Nerdbird flight. They call it the Nerdbird flight. Dulles to San Jose. A lot of spying went on in that plane.
What was that about?
The Nerdbird, because people are flying back and forth. Tech lobbyists. This is when the growth of the tech bros, venture cap, Silicon Valley, venture capital got involved in all of that, right? Okay.
Wow.
Including up to Sand Hill Road to make the case for small boutique.coms who were given a bunch of venture capital money, nondescript office, technology level playing field. They had a, good-looking secretary sitting up front just for anybody that came to the front door, but the building itself was nondescript, some office complex. Meanwhile, in the back room, the couple of 3 or 4 or 5 back rooms, depending how much money they got, they had a bunch of code cutters, to say that loosely, developing the next killer app. That became the phrase. We got to develop the next killer app. Because internet had exploded.
Yes.
Okay, in the interview, just in the last, especially with the web. Okay, and browsers.
Right.
And it's like, how do we exploit this? We're going to make, and people were it was staggering amounts of money being dumped. And the conferences that I went to, this was the heyday of you would go into where they have all the companies, and they all started outdoing each other. Who had the fanciest stand and all the little things they would give away, and some got really fancy. I mean, it was quite something. It was a world, right? It was quite a world.
The .com bubble.
And I could tell, I even almost moved to San Jose. I almost moved there, but I realized it had become a gambling environment. People were just rolling the dice. Right. Fact is, on average, only about 1 out of 14 companies ever actually made it. And then would usually get swallowed up by some bigger company. Okay. I saw all this happen, right? All in front of me.
Right.
So I'm sitting there February of 2001. NSA was under huge pressure because they weren't solving the problem, just to say it simply. Huge pressure from stakeholders and others, studies, like, you got to do something. Maybe you need to stir up the gene pool. Maybe you need to bring in senior people with outside experience, both government and industry, and bring them into NSA, put them in senior positions, and let them make the necessary changes. I was part of about 6-month period, roughly. There was a couple of people who had been hired in a little sooner, where about a dozen of us were hired in from the outside. I applied. They actually went to careerbuilders.com. Remember monster.com?
Oh, yeah.
They tried to do this like high-tech ITs would do, or startups. How do you hire people? They realized on the government, they couldn't go through the normal government cycle because it would just take too long.
Right.
Way too long. And they had to have security clearances on top of that.
Right.
So they accelerated, compressed it all. I went through, even though it wasn't the position I originally applied for, I went through a multi-month process, but for NSA, it was basically 2 months. And then I started going up. I kept making the cut to the point where I made the cut. Two of us made the cut with the person I ultimately reported to when I was hired. And I got hired. They accelerated because I already had a clearance. Okay. So that only took a couple of months. I started in late August. I had a different color badge. I took the oath, and this is critical. I'm now taking the oath as a senior civilian, Defense Intelligence Senior Executive Service. I'm taking the oath for the 5th time in my career to do what? Support and defend the Constitution of the United States of America against all enemies, foreign and domestic. I'm taking an oath, not loyalty, not to a person, not to an agency, not to secrets or secrecy, not to corruption, not to cover up. I'm taking an oath to a piece of paper.
To defend the Constitution.
The thing that defines who you are as a country and
Yes.
makes us Americans, with all the amendments. Particularly the first 10. Okay. 5th time, I had done, twice in the Air Force because I had re-upped.
Yep.
Once in the Navy, once at CIA as an officer there, and then now as a senior executive. In fact, all the jobs I had when I was at NSA over a 6.5-year period, my supervisor was always reporting to the top deck, the civilian head, which was the deputy director, who then reported to the director as a military head.
Okay.
So first day I reported to my new duty station as a senior executive was 9/11. And this is where life rapidly shifted in short order a little bit later that morning. And I pause because even to this day, and I feel it right now emotionally, okay? You're probably going to see it in my face because almost 3,000 people were murdered that day, and they never should have disappeared. They never should have lost their lives. It never should have happened. What do you do? This is a moment of truth for me. I was already incredibly alarmed. I'm already gone to the most senior people at that time. I've already gone to the Office of General Counsel. I've already confronted the director of the signals intelligence. In that moment, as I got off the phone with that attorney, I said, I cannot remain silent. If I remain silent, I am complicit in the subversion of the Constitution. I took an oath, support, and defend for basically my entire military career, government career.
Right.
I'm not going to let the government violate the Constitution. You can have both. This thing about it's black or white, liberty or security. You actually can have both at the same time and compromise neither. There's that famous Benjamin Franklin quote.
Right. Security for
For
freedom.
those who, yes, you can sell both. They aired, and even Hayden himself admitted, we drew that line. He always used sports.
What was it? What is the exact? It's like, when you trade your freedoms for securities, you had
A little bit. Those who seek a little will lose both. Basically, lose both.
Right.
Yeah, a little liberty for security will lose both. There's a larger quote around that.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
In that moment, I knew I could remain silent, but I knew by not remaining silent, I would put myself at extraordinary risk. I'm a senior executive. I had taken the oath.
Sure, yeah.
I have a fundamental responsibility.
But you decided to go about doing it
All through channels.
through the correct
Yes.
legal way it should be
Yes. So I'm going to accelerate this because then how was I punished? Right. And this is where life literally was turned upside down for me, because even then I was being tagged as a troublemaker. Okay. So I decided to blow the whistle. I went to the Inspector General. I then went secretly, which was allowed under the Intelligence Community Whistleblower Protection Act, an actual act of Congress.
Right.
I could go, at the time, they modified it later. I could go directly to the intelligence committee's oversight, both HIPSI and CISI. I'm just, without expanding it, but it's the secret. I could go to them to share my concerns in private. Now, there's a risk that I could be exposed. It turns out every channel that I went to, all the official channels were exposure channels. So I'm disclosing, but I'm being exposed at the same time. You could argue in part the intelligence communities were already co-opted, owned by the intelligence community in large part. Right, they're beholden. Remember, it's secret, right?
Yeah.
You go to a secret chamber, even in the Capitol, right?
So you went to these proper secret channels.
Then I was subpoenaed, equivalent of being subpoenaed, prima facie testimony, evidence, material evidence and testimony to 2 9/11 congressional investigations. One was Saxby Chambliss. They had been a recently formed Homeland Security, provide all kinds of information to them, which was basically the precursor to the joint 9/11 joint inquiry. Both of the committees.
Okay. Wow.
All of that was suppressed. No one to this day can find my testimony or the highly classified information I gave them.
Really?
And I didn't keep it at home. And I didn't secret it away.
Right.
I didn't hide it somewhere in a basket or in a pumpkin.
Right.
So I can laugh about it now. Okay. But so that's spring, fall, or summer. I was not part. People think I was interviewed by the 9/11 Commission. I know why I wasn't, because they didn't want me on the record. But no one can find. In fact, I was told later that what I provided in the joint 9/11 inquiry was so classified it couldn't be in the classified report. What does that tell you? They covered up. They helped cover up for NSA. NSA had a lot of egg on its face. Now it's,
and some of the stuff that you said, you still can't even say today.
Not the classified stuff,
right? Not the classified stuff, right?
But they were at the heart of the failure. There gets into great detail because this is what happened. So I was able. I couldn't put any of these programs, or the ones I was telling you about, including ThinThread and a bunch of others, weren't allowed to go operational because they were continuing to spend. They were, in fact, oh no, I was sitting in a meeting and my supervisor, the director of the Signals Intelligence Directorate, says, 9/11 is a gift to NSA. We're going to get all the money we want and then some. And that's certainly what happened. Congress just opened it up. They opened up the coffers and just started pumping even more billions.
Who said 9/11 was a gift to NSA?
My supervisor, the
supervisor.
Signals Intelligence Director. It was just it's now this haunting quote sitting right next to her where she says 9/11 is a gift to NSA. I was in a meeting. We were going around together because as part of I led the communications part of my leadership and communications team. We're going around to the workforce because they needed to be held. People are just really taking this hard. I encouraged her to go around, not just to console, but to be seen and explain, what are we going to do? And she's sitting in this meeting, this one particular meeting, saying, I'm just sitting there with my where she says 9/11 is a gift to NSA, we'll get all the money we want and then some.
Christ, man.
Because they're always, we never got enough money. If we just had enough money, we could, no, it's not about the money. And you'd already solved the core challenge problems already. So I then was part of the thing about this is the Department of Defense Inspector General. My other colleagues, I was anonymous because I was still working. They were all retired, including Diane Rourke, who was the staffer on the House Permanent Select Committee. She had the primary NSA account, Republican primary NSA account. I had made secret connections with her to give her a heads up on what the heck was going on at NSA early on, okay, after 9/11.
Okay.
But remember, then I was in with formal, right, with investigators. In fact, under 9/11, they were so hyper about. See, NSA wanted to put childminders along with me. They wanted to know exactly what I was going to share. The investigators, to their credit, said no. So, but I was spirited down to basically a secret. It was nondescript government building where I was then interviewed in this building. I wasn't interviewed like at NSA or for the joint inquiry.
Right.
They were that because that's what was happening, all this pushback, because it was exposing a lot of embarrassing details about how the entire intelligence community had failed to prevent. And all Congress said, how do we stop this again? How do we prevent another 9/11? That was a big thing. How do we prevent another 9/11? So I was part of this DOD Inspector General investigation. Went on for a while. I was the primary source. Thousands of pages, corruption, the fraud, the billions in waste, the thin thread versus Trailblazer, thin thread versus Stellar Wind, which was obviously super classified. At that time, and it had been for several years, as it turns out, right? That went on for a while. I was flagged and tagged left and right. All kinds of retaliation, reprisals started occurring. I started getting shifted. That's how I ended up at the National Defense University, out of sight, out of mind. We accelerate to November of 2005. I make a fateful decision. And by the way, as a side note right now, this is about the furthest and longest I've ever publicly said how all this transpired. There's a lot more behind what I said in terms of details and fascinating human dynamics, right? But I've never really gone this far, right? Because most interviews don't last very long.
Right, right.
So here it is, November 2005. I decided I had one last chance to make my case to the new director of NSA, Keith Alexander, who actually was much more technologically savvy. He did not take kindly to my blowing the whistle. I sent him a letter. Caused quite a stir. But the last thing, Trailblazer, they had decided Trailblazer, it got canceled in 2006. But he was convinced that he could do it better. And then there was a follow-on program called Turbulence, all these T programs. Yeah, T programs. See, this is the kicker for me. I'm just on a kind of a weird masculine level. Yeah. We had the T at NSA. The T in NSA had already been fully demonstrated, okay? But low T is what they focused on.
Right.
As much as they projected high T, I have never said this before, it was low T for sure. Look, if you take on and you solve the problem, that has its own reward. It's not about spending money. You want to make sure you create and deploy systems that actually provide for the common defense.
Yep.
So he didn't like it. Shortly thereafter, middle of December, this above the fold, old school print newspaper, New York Times, Eric Lichtblau, James Risen, publishes for the first time a exposure of this warrantless wiretapping program that had been in existence just after 9/11. Now, there was a huge scramble in the entire intelligence community, but particularly the NSA. They went apoplectic. Bush, there's public statements. You go on the internet, you'll see public statements from Cheney and Bush and a bunch of others about, oh my gosh, they just blew. It was one of the most secret programs.
Yeah.
Is one of the most secret programs in history. Modern America.
What year did this come out?
This was December 2005. Still out there.
Okay.
The article itself.
And
there was updates to it.
When did Snowden blow the whistle? Or
2013.
2013. Oh, that was
way
later. Wow.
Okay. Remember, I've been following all the developments internally. The program was rapidly metastasizing, even before it got out in public. Remember, I'm going through channels. I'm spending lots of time in front of investigators, sharing with them what I know.
Right.
At great risk.
Yes.
Extraordinarily risk. I was already. So, the article comes out. 2 weeks later, a massive national security leak investigation is launched by the DOJ. I knew, even when the article came out a couple weeks earlier, in December 2005, that I would be immediately targeted. Right. Because so few people do. In fact, this program was so secret that the only authorizing document was a memo, that was stored in David Addington's safe, chief of staff / attorney for Cheney, in his office safe.
Wow.
Even NSA sent their own attorneys down to get the authorization because they were so worried they wouldn't have cover. You always look at what's the cover. You want a lawful order. You get into lawful orders. I know that from the Uniform Code of Military Justice. You only have to follow lawful orders. Nuremberg trials principle.
Yep.
Which was their excuse. We're just following orders. No, lawful orders. It wasn't lawful to break the Constitution. And there's lawful means to update the Constitution. But national security just had this huge carve out, right? This huge exemption. Remember, exigent conditions, but now it's like permanent.
Right.
We're now in 2005. So accelerate forward. I knew that I became a target, a person of interest and a target as of spring 2006. Back up just a couple of months. I wrestled with this for quite a while after my last email with the director of NSA. There was one last route I could go, but it wasn't authorized. I grew up in an era when I became intimately familiar, until I met him later, but intimately familiar in terms of the history, Daniel Ellsberg. Pentagon Papers.
Pentagon Papers, yeah.
Yes. He went through channels. No one would listen to him in terms of the bright and shining light of Vietnam, a whole nother story. He was part of the study that showed it was, but it was buried, it was classified. Not all of them, there was stuff in there that was quite secret that he didn't release to the press. He ultimately went to the press, unauthorized, ended up facing 115 years because of government malpractice. The judge threw the case out. I was there wrapped, a young teenager, right?
Danny Sheehan. Big part of that.
So I had one last route. I could touch the third rail, go to the press. And NSA, if you go to the press without authorization, and I knew what it was like if you have to have something published. I had something published based on my work I did on Jackpot in IEEE Computer Magazine in 1996 when I was doing all my really highly technical stuff. I had to go through the whole with a classification review officer just to make sure it was good.
Yep.
It took months.
Right.
Here, I'm going to go to the press without any authorization. But at that time, it only violated administrative policy. It didn't violate the Constitution. It was not a crime. It wasn't criminal to go to the press. However, I knew if I did, I could end up just like Ellsberg. I already knew that. Some people thought I was stupid and naive and didn't know that. That's not true at all. I knew exactly what the risks were. I knew not only could I lose my job, probably would, but worse, I could be charged on the espionage. I knew that. So how do you go to the press where and this is, I wouldn't get into all this. Part of it is still technically classified.
Yeah. Wasn't the NSA spying on the press?
Yes. They had a special program as part of this larger, it's called First Fruits. Where they were monitoring certain media outlets and even individual reporters and journalists because they were so scared that something would come out, not just about the secret surveillance program, but the torture program.
Right.
Torture program came out way before this one did. Okay. Abu Ghraib.
Yep.
Yeah. Cy Hirsch. Right.
Right.
My Lai, that's where he became famous as a journalist. So I had that choice, and I won't go all the details, but I had one chance to make contact with a reporter, which worked, and ended up anonymously communicating with the reporter for about a year before I knew that I would ultimately have to go face to face. And so actually, through 2007, I was having infrequent, aperiodic face-to-face meetings with this reporter at even greater risk. Because as things progressed, I was under extraordinary electronic surveillance. I knew they'd eventually catch up with me. I knew that I might find myself being, pulled out of my house or having my house raided or my office down at the National Defense University. And that's exactly what happened.
What was it like when you realized, or was there like a specific point when you realized that the NSA had turned all of the surveillance onto you?
This is my technical background. I knew that they would start monitoring me electronically because they could.
Via
their own means. I could see, I set up logs. I could see where they're attempting to break into my system. I had a network at home. Remember, I've been long into this.
Okay.
I was, back in the early days, pre-internet,
Yes.
BBSs.
So
Waste,
you
Gopher. I was, before internet was internet in terms of public eye, back in the 80s.
you had stuff in place monitoring
Yes.
this, you were prepared for
Weird things like the Verizon DSL box would get reset. I'd call them up and they say, you have to pass. It's like, wait a minute. Yeah, they were remotely resetting it, but I had multiple firewalls, both hardware and software.
Wow.
I don't ever believe, although it's possible, I never saw that they actually got into my computers.
Oh, really?
No, that's right. I don't have any. In some ways, I take some pride in that. With all I knew what they had, what their capabilities were. But the problem was there's what's called zero-day exploits. There was always possible, right? So I had to assume I was compromised anyways. But see, people say, well, gee, if you know that, why didn't you get rid of everything? I had nothing to hide to use that, which I don't like that phrase because that comes from Joseph Goebbels, right? If you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to worry about. So who cares what we know about you? Wait a minute. That's not the point. I used to do exercises on privacy and people get to the point, oh yeah, no, that's me. Why is it you? No, because I don't want them to know it. Why? Because that's me. Oh, so there is some ownership here in terms of your own privacy. Right? Mm-hmm. Privacy is essential to even living.
Yes, 100%.
As much as people want to dump stuff out there, right? It's amazing what people put out there, right? But there is something about who we are, the essence but that's a different conversation.
Yes.
So I'm getting, then they start physically surveilling me. It was covert. This is where John Kiriakou knows that really, really well, better than I do. But it was clear that and then it started to be overt. They wanted to make clear that we're on to you. Like they were now
they want you to know that they're following you.
Wanted me to know. I was getting stopped quite frequently. They would have random searches. My searches weren't random at all. Coming to the gate, right? They had already alert based on the tags, the car description.
It's intimidation.
Oh, of course. Yeah. Huge.
Yeah.
So that went on until my colleagues, NSA, all retired, and then Diane Rourke were raided all on the same day in July of 2007. I knew that I was now the primary target and probably had been for a while. I was still at NSA. They probably had suspicion that I was in contact with a reporter. Although later they actually thought I was really in contact. They actually thought that was a cover, a cutout. There was like a cover, and that I was at like a convenient hangout, as they call it, right? Just a
limited hangout.
A limited hangout with her, but I had really been in contact for a longer period of time with the New York Times. Really? They later made up a whole chronology but it turned out I wasn't. Right? I never had any contact with the New York Times.
That's crazy.
So I knew in July that I was now the target.
Yeah.
And it was clear based on the last couple of meetings with the reporter, Siobhan Gorman, who at the time was working for the Baltimore Sun, later went to the Wall Street Journal. Now she's more in private. In consulting practice, has been for quite a while. I knew that there were agents in the room. Including, by the way, I found out later that they were actually using a significant number of agents from the Mole Hunter unit at FBI. Those are the ones that are trained to go after spies.
Like legitimate spies, foreign spies.
But that's how I was being treated worse than a spy. That's clear. I was now the threat. I was the leaker. I found out later that Cheney had issued a fine and fry the leaker. He just said, fine and fry them. I don't care. Just make sure it's someone, apparently, it has to be senior enough. But burn them. Make an object lesson of them. That's how I interpreted it.
Right.
So late November, I'm getting ready to go to work. I had two vehicles at the time. I had my hybrid, which is a Prius, and then I had a Toyota RAV4 EV. It was all electric. Limited. It was a limited run. I'm getting ready in the other bedroom, right, to get in my car, go down to the metro and go down. And then there was a bus that would shuttle me over from the Coast Guard headquarters take me to one of the metro stations, drop me off by bus, a government bus in front of, and then I walked to my office where I was teaching and had been for a couple of years. It was actually during that time is when I met, we'll probably want to take a break here shortly, but that's when I met Elon Musk.
Oh,
During the time I was at the National Defense University, where I was teaching in the Industrial College of the Armed Forces.
okay.
And I was a co-lead on their space industries team. That's how I ended up going to SpaceX
Wow.
with some students.
Okay.
Yeah, a bunch of different. We went to Cape Kennedy. We went out to
wow.
We went out to Cheyenne Mountain. I mean, went inside the Cheyenne Mountain. Right. We went to a number of different sites. Right. So I'm getting ready for work. I look out the window and I see a bunch of agents streaming across the front yard and a bunch of cars pulling up as they're piling out.
Oh no.
And that's where, I mean, the moment is another one of those moments because, this is years later, right? But that article had come out, right, almost 2 years ago, right? This is, we're talking. And so remember, they've had this multi-million-dollar national leak investigation going on as to who were the sources for the New York Times in particular. I got caught up in that for all the reasons I gave earlier because so few people knew about the program. Mm-hmm. Even though they argued later, it's just some disagreement between two programs, Synthread, Trailblazer, while that was like the limited cutout as to why they came after me, when in fact it wasn't that at all. It was the fact that Stellar Wind had been revealed, even though I had not provided any classified information about the program to anybody outside of channels.
Right.
Not even the reporter.
Right.
So you can imagine knocking on the door. They said, they told me later, if you hadn't opened it, they knocked twice. They had a battering ram with them. No kidding that they would have used the battering ram to punch through the door. And then you can file a claim later for damages.
Your son answered
the door because it's upstairs. I said, Zachary, go answer the door. He's had the presence of mind. He says,
and you didn't say.
Oh, I knew.
You didn't tell him.
I hadn't told anybody. Man, I kept this a secret from my own family.
No, I mean, you didn't tell him the FBI's at the door.
No, of course not.
How old was he?
He was okay. 95. He would have been 12. Middle school. So normally my spouse would take him to the middle school, right, in the local town, and then I would pick him up, right, after school. So, yeah, bunch of agents come in. They start sweeping the house. I had a choice. They read me my Miranda rights. I didn't have to cooperate. Obviously, I could have said, "I'm getting, you're going to have to deal with my attorney." I didn't have an attorney at that time. Right at that moment, I didn't have an attorney. So I said, this is one final time to blow the whistle. I named president, the vice president, senior people, including Hayden, about what had gone down over the last 6+ years. No, we're not here for that. We understand you violated, certain laws, and so we're here to collect evidence. And we can interview you, or you don't have to. I didn't have to be interviewed. Obviously, I had Miranda rights. I could have remained silent. I said, no, it was sort of an interview, it was interrogation. That was one of 3, by the way. They took notes. I knew anything I said would be
right, of course,
used against me. It was.
So you mentioned that the 1993 bombing of the World Trade Center.
Oh, yes. This is critical to what literally became the split in the time-space continuum for me, the U.S. and the world.
Okay.
Because without this particular event, so let me go back. See, this is Joseph Lockhart. You'll want me to talk about Joseph Lockhart from Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941, a day of infamy. That never should have happened either. I can tell you, in terms of the damage, let alone the warning. There was a warning. The warning went out. It got rejected.
Why did it get rejected?
Because it wasn't considered important enough. The duty officer said, he decided that, it's not worth reporting, not worth sending out the alert. to move airplanes on the fails pointed nose, basically wingtip to wingtip, to move ships out or to alert the crews so they can actually man the anti-aircraft guns. But that gets, I interviewed Joseph Lockhart.
Yeah, there's a lot of documentaries out there that speculate that was that they let that happen as an excuse to enter the war.
I think there's a both and here. It's not either or. This is all people want this simplistic.
People want it to be black and white.
It's not black or white.
Black and white.
It's not. It's not. But Roosevelt was looking for a way. He was already supporting Britain.
Many things can be true at once.
Yes, many things can be true, and they can even appear to be contradictory.
Yep. Yeah.
And yet still, yes. So 1993, I sent out a message. This is one that's going to haunt me for the rest. This is the first haunt of my life, right? Being within the deep state. I sent a message saying they may have failed to drop the World Trade Center. I said it this way. I'm paraphrasing myself. They may have failed to drop the World Trade Center, but they're coming back. They're coming back. We must warn all the command authorities about what their intent is. They're coming back. This is not a one-time event. This is not a one-off event.
And how?
We've been doing long-term, short-term, mid-term analysis.
So this was the analysis of it.
Yes.
We knew they were coming back.
Remember, I'm drawing on my entire, this is the thing. People don't realize what it takes to become fully, is knowledgeable in your space. You're basically, you're not just an area specialist. In this case, I was sitting in the terrorism desk. I had to know as much as I could know that was possible. And we had all kinds of updated topic areas on terrorism, right? What's the latest? And you keep iterate, publish it, publish it, because the desk rotates. I mean, I was only there on weekends. I was a weekend warrior because I was in the reserves. Usually at least once a month. So I was there for 2 full cycles. Sometimes Friday night till Sunday, sometimes from Saturday through Monday morning. And then I would go to work. And at that time I was working at Booz Allen and Hamilton, a whole nother part of my career.
Oh, wow.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. So I sent out this report. Now it's an internal, but it gets all the way to the J2, which is usually a 1 or 2 star general.
Okay.
He comes down to the alert center, and the alert center itself it's 24 hours. Normally run usually by a 06, usually a captain Navy or a colonel Air Force Army, and it rotates, right, depending on who's on shift and working. It can be temporarily filled by a senior like lieutenant colonel in 05. But flag level, because it's a flag level position, it's usually an 06. Generals begin at 07 and then go up to 010. And so he comes down, he literally, which is rare. He rarely ever came down, right? But he comes down in the alert center, says, "Yeah, I saw your report." And this is almost literally what he said out loud. "Yeah, who cares? Who cares about some raghead issuing fatwas in the desert sitting under a fig tree?" And I paused because it's like, he just dismissed it. I was classically trained in terms of intelligence. It's an art and a science. It's not perfect. It has confidence levels. Some cases you have low confidence. Sometimes you have high confidence.
Right.
We had pretty high confidence that they meant business. There had already been a series of terrorist incidents. You can go back to the Reagan, right? Remember Beirut? And we didn't do anything. He just pulled us out.
Yeah.
People have argued about why did he do that? Some say it actually emboldened the terrorists. Never mind sort of the larger geopolitical dynamics in terms of history, which in itself gets complicated enough. Okay.
Right.
But remember, a bunch of French military lost their lives too in the Beirut, not just U.S. So it was clear the system, and this is where you get in, is people, it wasn't considered. Remember, you got to remember what year it is. This is critical in context. Context is everything here. Remember, I was classically trained. Indications of warning. Duty to warn, but indications. You don't want to wait until you warn. You also want to be in the decision loop, no matter what it is, ahead of time. And what's the whole focus? To keep people out of harm's way. Not just U.S. It could be allies, friendly, period. If you know there's an international airliner like KL007, I'm jumping ahead again, okay, but the same year. I mean, go back 10 years in 1983, which I have inside knowledge on that one. If you know there's an international airliner flying outside of its route, okay, and you know that it's now being perceived as an RC-135, that's how the Russians in the west, the far eastern district, perceived it. They're not going to take it too kindly. They're particularly sensitive to that part of their country. It never should have been shot down. I'm just going to tell you, but that's a what if for me because it got shot down. All those passengers on a 747.
This was what year?
1983.
83.
KL007. Korean Airlines.
Oh, yes.
I was stationed at Mildenhall, but we got all the reports. I knew people that worked at the Misawa unit. There was then a secret collection unit way up Wakanai. I can say it now, way up on the coast. It was the most northern collection, but at the time it was highly super sensitive. I knew people that worked there. And they sent out I mentioned the critic reporting system, which is supposed to get on the president's desk within 10 minutes. Issued it, got rejected by NSA. Issued it again, got rejected by NSA. Then it was too late.
Oh my God.
They thought it was an exercise back at headquarters. They didn't trust the field. That's why you have the alert system. The field site is supposed to provide for that type of coverage. You didn't just have a responsibility to quote unquote spy, collect intelligence on a adversary. You also had a responsibility to the civilian side of the world. This is a civilian airliner. It's not a military airliner at all. But they thought it was an RC-135. Why? Because a Cobra Ball mission, another variant of the RC-135, didn't fly in it, but I certainly knew people that did, happened to be in the area. What were they waiting for? A launch from Kamchatka, because that's typically how the Soviets at the time, they would launch into the Pacific. Got thousands and thousands of miles. It's out in the boonies on this huge peninsula. But we monitor it with super specialized equipment. Without going into all the details, they end up going home. They switched the tracks, so they call it, on the radar because the radar back over there wasn't that as advanced. And they kept thinking as they saw this, what they thought was an RC-135 violating their airspace as it flew over the peninsula and into the Sea of Okhotsk. And they said, "Oh, we better go up and shoot it down." The order was given to shoot it down, and they got shot down. All this was captured. Now, Reagan made a big deal out of it because it was incredibly embarrassing because it turns out they shot down a civilian airliner. In the profile, if you're on radar, the profile, even looking at it, even though a 747 is actually quite a bit larger than an RC-135, but it kind of looks the same.
Can you pull up a picture of an RC-135, Steve?
They both have 4 engines. It's similar in terms of the angle of the wing. That's one of the, plane. That's I believe is a combat scent variant.
Wow.
There's different variants, of course.
Okay.
But if you look at that and then compare it to a 747.
Very similar.
In profile, from a distance, it's similar. On the radar, a few feet here and there, can't really tell. They thought it was an RC-135.
That's a 747.
Yeah. What made you want to go to the CIA?
Because it's my background and interests. And it's like, hey, I knew I finished up my first master's when I was in Tucson in international relations and national security policy. And I applied and went through a very extremely rigorous review process, including even more enhanced background investigations, and you had to have a poly. It was the first time I was exposed to where you're hooked up to the polygraph machine. And all kinds of test after test after test. I was finally offered a position. I left. I had an opportunity to go to operations and go overseas, basically undercover. There's different covers at NSA. There's official, non-official. There's what they call NOx. You probably heard NOx.
NOx, yeah.
Non-official.
I heard about that recently.
They wanted at one point, they wanted me to be official.
A knock is someone who's like deniable, right?
Yeah, well, deniable, but you're on your own. If something happens, they're not going to like. It's the most risk. It's the riskiest of all.
Right, like you're.
They're not going to come save you. That's exactly. Right. Oh yeah. So I chose not to go that route. I had a young family. I'd come back from stay. I'm now out. It's like no, I'm not that young anymore. But I did go into their director of intelligence, and so I was working what you call national technical means. Satellite intercept collection technology. And I was at a downlink site, the primary downlink site in which you processed all that.
So going back to when you decided you want to go to CIA, is that an easy process? I mean, I imagine I imagine it's more seamless coming from NSA.
Oh yeah, of course.
Yeah.
In the military background. That was partly why they were interested, right?
And so they reached out first?
No,
Okay,
I did.
Okay.
I did. But just to give you just a sense of the initial phase of it.
Yeah.
They give you an address, which was a nondescript motel. You knock on a door a certain number of times. There was basically there was a code. They opened the door, and that's how it started. That was the first interview.
Wow.
Yep. Yeah.
And what kind of stuff did they ask you? What kind of
everything?
Like John alluded to a little bit of the stuff that he had talked about.
Everything and anything, including sexual preferences.
Really? Yeah, that's what John was saying.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, they get nitty gritty with that stuff.
I mean, it is about as a true think of, and of course, I ended up experiencing this in a different way later when I was under electronic and physical surveillance, when they decided that I was, such a threat to the national security that we're going to have to charge him. But during the investigation, I was under all kinds of surveillance.
Right.
But just imagine an electron microscope being pointed at your life, and anything you have ever done, any evidence at all of your all of it, no matter who you met, where you worked, what you did. Wow. And then they get into your head.
How do they know all that? I mean,
what
year is this?
This is 88. I was going the background investigation. They don't even. What's interesting, they don't even start the clearance because they can leverage. Obviously, they leverage I had all kinds of background because I was at one of the highest levels because it was sensitive compartment information. That was the baseline. Never mind SAP, SAR, and a lot of compartments later, or even more when I got to NSA as a senior executive. I'm talking just that. So they could leverage that. For them, the psychological was probably by far, that was where they really get intrusive, and they had special permission. This is similar to what I went through in the classified training. Okay. So the classified training, the resistance training, but the highly classified part of it, is they had special permission to violate your privacy, Fourth Amendment. They could. It was basically you're just saying you're consenting to we can get anything on you. We don't have to have you sign a paper or we're going to go here and go there. It's just anything. And they literally had things that something I had forgotten about that would come up.
And what is the means of finding stuff like they use
in the
80s?
They use
like there's no cell phones, there's no computers, right?
Yeah, but they've got all kinds of access to databases even then. And interviews they have with neighbors and friends and where you lived and what your potential. Remember, the whole thing is about trust and risk.
Analog.
Trust. Yeah. Well, yes. There was. You have to forget there were still computers back then. Right.
There were computers. Right.
But they were
primitive.
And most of them were mainframes. Right. But there were still tons of paper-based records. Still tons. Much more laborious to go through.
Yeah.
Incredibly intrusive. So yeah, they're just drilling down into your life. They want to know how trustworthy you were. So they test you.
Yeah.
And the tests were very sophisticated in terms of preferences and how you thought and if you were in these circumstances, but extremely, extremely rigorous.
To you, what was the most interesting one?
The ones were actually the face-to-face interviews. Yeah, those were the most dramatic.
Really?
Well, because in part, there was interviews without the poly, there was interviews with polys. Yeah.
And which one, to you, was like, what the hell are they?
It was the ones where they're really lifestyle questions. Those the hardcore lifestyle girlfriends, friendships, associations, who you may have been a part of. I mean, like I said, they just
try to make you uncomfortable.
The onion, they just keep peeling your life away, right?
So you
ring by ring.
So you get admitted. They say, "Okay, Tom, you're in, baby."
Yeah. So then
you're officially a spook.
Well, I was an intelligence analyst. It was imagery analyst.
Okay.
I could have gone that route, but that's in essence its own CIA. CIA at the time, Central Intelligence Agency, but the one you always hear about is the operations. There's several different parts of CIA.
Right.
The one I was in was the director of intelligence. So this is the part that's linked to NRO. Part, yeah. Plus a SIGINT division and a bunch.
NRO is a funny one.
That was even more secret than NSA.
I know, that's crazy because NRO, a lot of people don't know about NRO.
No, they don't, because it was one of the other agencies. The irony, of course, for me, I mean, I'm jumping ahead a little bit. NSA itself was never part of the National Security Act of 47. It was never legislated by Congress. It was literally created out of thin air by the stroke of Harry S. Truman's pen in 1952 as a secret military agency to collect and analyze and report on foreign intelligence. Which got you, they were given carte blanche.
And when was the NRO created again?
61.
You're
talking the Cuban, that period, it's like, oh my God, it became formalized, right?
Right. And NRO.
But it operated in secret under sort of the aegis of CIA. It was its own, but it operated under.
It was like under the umbrella.
Yeah, and it still was even when I was there.
It's like CIA of the sky.
You could say that, and in essence, it was a subsidiary. You want to use a corporate term, it was a subsidiary of CIA, specializing in national technical means. That was always the phrase that was used. National technical means typically meant primarily spaceborne assets,
like satellites.
But there are other types of assets. Yeah.
What other types are there?
Well,
like
there's
planes and stuff.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, they had. Remember, the original SR-71 was actually a CIA asset.
Right.
U-2 flights, right? Were under, right?
That was all part of NRO.
Well,
there was CIA. It was
CIA.
Right.
This is where it gets. I mean, get into the weeds with all the different assets. But NRO primarily was focused on that was national technical means in terms of spaceborne.
Right. Okay.
And that's spaceborne across the board. Everything you heard about later, which became the torture program, I went through all of that. I know exactly what it means. I was waterboarded a couple times in a training environment. Feels like you're drowning alive. The one that was the worst was the Chinese water drip. They had instructors who started enjoying it, and they would have to pull them out of the program. So I was at Fairchild Air Force Base, and I went through in the field, surviving. I mean, this is the SEER program. It's the whole survive, escape, resist. Right? It's a whole program in which you learn how to evade, how to survive, how to resist, and how to escape. That's the initials for SEER. So it had a prisoner of war camp. It had a highly classified component, which is how do you resist when they're psychologically torturing and interrogating.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah.
This is still super classified stuff, right?
Still super classified. It's probably, of all the trainings I received in the military, it's the one that has stuck with me the most after all these years.
Really?
And we can get back to that later because there were certain things about that training that actually helped me resist the government, deal with the government.
Oh, wow.
So I was actually using training that the government paid for during my survival school.
Wow.
At SEER in Fairchild Air Force Base, in Eastern Washington. The actual in the field part of survival and evading. And it was we're talking extremely rigorous. It's still a training environment. So, they had safety monitors, there was boundaries, but we were out in the woods for quite a few days.
During this training,
learning how to survive. And then you come back, you go through prisoner of war camp. That was quite something. I actually went through everything you heard about later, which became the torture program, which they called enhanced interrogation techniques.
Yeah.
It was torture because they reverse engineered it. I went through all of that. I know exactly what it means. I was waterboarded a couple times in a training environment. Feels like you're drowning alive. I was put into pretty interesting stress positions. The one that was the worst was the Chinese water drip.
What's the Chinese water drip?
They strap you down and they just slowly drip water onto your forehead.
How long do they do that for?
For a while, until the point where you just want to itch and you can't because you're strapped down, and it just goes. You just really get crazy.
And this is all the type of shit they do like Guantanamo and those black sites, right?
But remember, the constraints were, and they had safety monitors, right? Is in a training environment, but it's extraordinarily realistic.
Right.
The other one, which a lot of people freaked out in, was the box. Something they did later, but that is part of their torture. They stick you in a box and then they close it, meaning it's a specially designed box. And what they do is they bind it down so that there's no room to move. You cannot move and you're all crouched.
Oh yeah, I've seen this. They did this to Abu Zubaydah, I think.
Yeah.
And you did the box?
I did the box. Oh, I went to sleep.
God, bro.
I did the box.
Is it really that small?
Oh yeah. Yeah, and the box is an interesting design because it's not just a fixed volume. They can actually
shrink it. Oh no.
And you cannot move. They can shrink it down to a point where you cannot move.
That's so crazy.
Threw me in the hole. Yeah.
I heard that they have specifically at Guantanamo, some of the stuff they were doing, some of the 9/11 prisoners they had, was that they would like put them in a room and play like SpongeBob SquarePants for days on end.
Yep.
And like, or just play like Barney, I love you, you love me for a week straight until
we had a version of that in this prisoner war camp at very high decibel with the lights blaring. Plus you would have a bag over your head most of the time where you couldn't even see anything.
And what, like, the purpose of putting you guys through this stuff is to kind of numb you to it? Is that what the goal is? Not numb you,
to learn how to resist
it. To learn how to resist it.
And not have them break you.
And you're not allowed to talk about how to resist it.
I can talk a bit more about the prisoner of war part, but not the classified training. The classified training. So you have like, what do you deal with when they're pounding on you physically and putting you in all kinds of weird positions, sleep deprivation, bright lights, loud music, and a whole other things I haven't even mentioned yet, a whole range of other, because it goes on for a while.
Yeah.
I mean, they're really, and in fact, they have special instructor. I mean, the instructors themselves had to be carefully trained. And because what happens if you start enjoying the pathological
enjoying the abuse of people?
Oh yeah. I mean, I can say it right now. They had instructors who started enjoying it and they would have to pull them out of the program.
Oh my God,
yeah.
dude.
Stanford, we're talking way worse.
So dark.
Extremely dark. Oh no, even that part of the training sticks to me this day. And speaking of sticking, one song I remember was a napalm song. It was basically a war protest song from the Vietnam era. And they would just play that at super high decibels. Plus they had all kinds of like psychological, I mean, they would try to break you in terms of you being American, and they would bring up all the literal facts about all the issues that, yeah, there's some dark history in America, and it's going across, the continent and pushing all the indigenous peoples out of the way and slavery. They would actually tell you the truth about your own country. And that was one way, because that was indoctrination. They would basically attempt to re-indoctrinate you, but they had to basically separate you from your own culture and your own history, and pointing out, of course, all the worst of its evils. I put evils in quote. Wow. Some of which were pretty dark. There's no question that there are aspects of American history that are dark. We're not a perfect nation.
Right.
But we are America.